Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening for the annual Chancellor's Lecture. As you know, the Chancellor's job is to be a sort of mascot, I suppose. I don't know whether that flatters me too much, but certainly to have absolutely no executive power, which for this university is, in my case, probably extremely fortunate. But I do have one privilege, which is to nominate every year a Chancellor's Lecturer. And over the years, I hope you all agree, we've been extremely fortunate in having some very distinguished speakers. There is, of course, a Chancellor's Lecturer, but there's also the Vice-Chancellor's Lecture. And the difference, you will immediately understand, is that the Vice-Chancellor delivers his own, while with one exception, the Chancellor does not, which I think is a very proper indication of our respective abilities. But we are very fortunate to have so many of you here this evening. You're all very welcome. I'd particularly like to welcome Robert Voss, our Lord Lieutenant, whose schedule makes me quail. He's always out and working hard, and as you know, he is a distinguished member of the University Board, which he continues to be. Sarah Beasley, High Sheriff of Hertfordshire, Alderman Peter Ruffles, a very old friend of mine, representing the Chairman of the Hertfordshire County Council, Councillor Roger and Mrs. Carol Trigg, Mayor and Mayoress of Welwyn Hatfield Borough Council, Councillor Jonathan Kay, Chairman of the East Hertfordshire District Council. So it's wonderful to see you all, and I hope that you're looking forward to this evening as much as I am. Our lecturer is somebody I've known for what's, looking back on it, seems to be an astonishingly long time. Jonathan Hill has a rather enviable CV. I first came across him, I think, quite a long time ago when he was John Major's political secretary in Number 10 during the early part of his premiership. He had been a special advisor to Kenneth Clarke, I think, when he was at Education, in the days when SPADs followed the remarkably sensible advice of the great Lord Fraser of Kilmarrack, which was to keep the backroom boys in the backroom. In those days, as Jonathan was quite right to ensure, the advisors were not the story. I don't know quite what's happened since. He then went to run his own public affairs company with great success, giving strategic advice to many great institutions, commercial and otherwise, before being called back to become a Minister of State for Schools between 2010 and 2013, when he was responsible for implementing the Academies and Free Schools reforms. But that wasn't the end of the matter. He was nominated in 2014 by David Cameron as the United Kingdom's European Commissioner. And when he arrived in Brussels, he assumed a very difficult portfolio and an extraordinarily important one, particularly in view of the financial history of Western Europe. He was responsible for financial regulation across the whole of Europe, and one of his flagship programs was the development of European Capital Markets Union, which was designed to increase the flow of investment capital throughout the UK. He resigned as Commissioner in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 referendum, but I can assure you that he is still extraordinarily well connected in Brussels, where he is very highly regarded and has very close links now with the UK Treasury. He has described what he's about to say this evening with usual self-deprecation as a rant. I can assure you that what he says will be extremely strongly felt, but I think that we can look forward to something which is not only well argued, but very well structured. And I hugely look forward, Jonathan, to what you have to say.
Robert, thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. The timing that the Chancellor has chosen for this lecture, which clearly he knew, to be here with Parliament dissolved as we head towards a general election, is immaculate in terms of giving me an opportunity to look back and reflect on our political system, to look at some of the ways which I think it has changed for the worse over the last 30, 35 years, but also to ask ourselves how we might be able to make it better. And I know that it is a commonplace these days to describe Britain as going through some kind of existential political crisis. But I want to start just for a moment by making the counter-argument that despite everything that has been going on, our politics has in fact proved to be very resilient. It's been subjected to the most extraordinary pressures over the last 3 years. It's been tested to destruction by a lack of leadership and by the lack of a majority in Parliament. But given that, the two-party system has survived to a remarkable degree. And right up until the election was called, the overwhelming majority of MPs kept voting again and again with their party whip. And for more than 3 years, every day outside Parliament, come wind or shine, supporters of Leave and Remain have gathered, waving flags and placards, booing and cheering. But in all that time, no matter how high emotions have been running, public order has not broken down. And the other day I got a text from a political friend in France, a French politician, saying that they were very worried that violence was going to break out on the streets of London. To which I said, "Don't worry, this is not France." And in fact, I'm not sure I can think of any other country in Europe where you could expose their political system to the strains that we've been through of the last 3 years and there not be some kind of public disorder. And I was recently reading about the 1910 general election, and I was struck by some of the descriptions of what was going on. Fire bombings carried out by suffragettes. Churchill's children had to have police protection for fear of kidnapping. Churchill himself was attacked at a public meeting with a dog whip. Now, we also read breathless commentary to the effect that Britain has never been so divided. But there are some of us I can see in this room who will be able to remember the 1970s, or the miners' strike, or the poll tax riots of the 1980s, let alone the general strike of 1926, the Chartists, or of course the English Civil War, where I think you could safely say that we were pretty divided. Literally in the case of Charles I. Now, in my view, then, the news of the death of the British parliamentary democratic system has therefore been greatly exaggerated. And indeed, I think you can argue that the deadlock we've seen in Parliament could be seen as a sign of parliamentary democracy actually working, as MPs did try to take responsibility after the executive had plainly failed. So that said, I do, though, believe that there are grounds for concern about how our political system has been functioning, and perhaps more importantly, about the capacity it now has for serious thought. Now, 30 years ago, almost to the day, the Berlin Wall fell. the most powerful symbol imaginable of the apparent triumph of the West. It was, we were told, the end of history. Today, the effects of globalization, of rapid technological change, of mass migration, the rise of China, they're all posing profound challenges to those very same societies which had imagined 30 years ago that the future belonged to them. Set in that context, I do not believe, as some argue, that it is Brexit which has caused our political crisis. Indeed, I think that that statement is itself a reflection of the extraordinary introspection and self-obsession which characterizes so much of our current political debate. Rather, I think we should see Brexit as the consequence of a political crisis which has been building largely unobserved for much longer. So tonight, instead of talking about the here and now, I want to take a longer view and look back at some of the changes that I've seen in politics over the past 35 years. I'm going to reflect on some of the things that I believe have contributed to the infantilization of our politics, and I'm going to make some suggestions as what we might do to make things better. And if at that point there are still some people that I have not offended, I'm going to risk upsetting everybody else by venturing a few words about how our universities can help us rebuild a healthier politics. So I'm going to start with a tale of two Whitehalls. The Whitehall I found when I joined as a young advisor back in 1986, and the Whitehall that I discovered when I joined the cabinet in 2013. Now, when I went to work at the Department of Employment in 86, seniority was still reflected in the number of windows that an official had in their office and by the height of the back of their chair. Submissions, the written advice from officials, were peppered with classical phrases and epigrams. You would never have seen a document with the word impact used as a verb. Policy advice lay at the heart of what officials did for a living, not public service delivery. McKinsey had not yet been let loose on Whitehall, or higher education for that matter, with their flip charts and their mind-numbing management speak. Whitehall had its failings, yes, but it knew what it was for. The people at the top had great intellectual self-confidence. They recruited new entrants to the civil service fast stream in their own image. At the time, there were no mobile phones. There was obviously no internet. I had a shorthand typist. So when I wanted to write a note to my Secretary of State, I had to go through the mental discipline of working out what I wanted to say before dictating it. There were fewer distractions, more concentration, more space for thinking. Technological limitations meant that it wasn't possible to keep on endlessly changing a draft, and it also meant that copy lists were small. Advice was put in, it went into the Secretary of State's red box, he would read it, he'd scribble on it, and further action was commissioned and recorded by the private office. Now that meant two things. First, there was a proper process with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And second, that process was much more secure. Copy lists were small, so the risk of leaks was lower. When I went to work at Number 10 a few years after that, phone calls from and to the Prime Minister all went through the extraordinarily efficient switch, which was the Number 10 switchboard. Duty clerks would place calls, a private secretary would listen in. Today, those calls, many of them are done by mobile, by text, so the scope for confusion and for misinterpretation is far greater. And I think the general culture in government in the 80s was very different. No one would say that Mrs. Thatcher was anything other than a very dominant personality. She certainly imposed a clear sense of direction on the government, but she was not a micromanager. The centre was much smaller, the whole reach of government generally was much smaller, and that meant that all the secretaries of state, the cabinet ministers, had far more devolved responsibility, and they had the space to develop into much bigger political figures. They still made speeches about their political philosophy, and they expected to submit themselves to lengthy scrutiny about it. Today, I think that the system has been centralised to a degree that in the 80s we would have regarded as quite extraordinary. Much more political activity and attention is centred on the figure of the Prime Minister. Announcements that back in the 80s would have been made by the most junior minister are now bagged by number 10 if they think that it will associate the Prime Minister with some passing piece of topical news. So our system feels more presidential, and the growing importance of European policy has meant that more power has been concentrated in the hands of the Prime Minister, with all the big decisions now being taken at the European Council. And then I think that there have been transformations in technology have played a big part in encouraging this drive towards centralisation. Because people working at number 10 are able to have instant access and to information and also to each other, whether that's by mobile, by text, by email, they've developed a spurious sense that it is possible and desirable to control everything the whole time. And centralisation has been driven forward by the development of what I'd call the culture of the grid, the idea that number 10 must manage the news cycle. It has to surf the daily media wave. And here, I think that 1997, when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, I think that was the key year. Determined to exercise more control from the centre, he did a number of things that profoundly changed both culture and practice. His first constitutional innovation was to create the role of a Chief of Staff and alter the rules so that for the first time a political appointee could formally issue instructions to a civil servant. Now, this might seem like a trivial change of interest only to constitutional nerds, but actually it sent a powerful message right into the heart of Whitehall about who was now the top dog. Before 97, there was a much clearer line between political and official business, and that was well understood and policed. As a special advisor, I was a political appointment, but I worked perfectly happily alongside my civil servant colleagues. Every now and again, there might be a little skirmish at the edges, usually over who got to sit in the car next to the Secretary of State or the Prime Minister, but most of the time we rubbed along pretty well. Contrast that to the story that appeared in the press a few years ago, when it was reported that one of Mrs. May's special advisors when she was Home Secretary had instructed a civil servant to publish confidential cabinet correspondence on the Home Office website in order to damage one of the Home Secretary's colleagues. Now, for me, that episode revealed quite how much has gone wrong in the system in terms of culture at every level. First, the fact that a political advisor would think it was acceptable in the first place to use an official website as a forum for waging a political vendetta. Second, that they should have presumed to instruct a civil servant to do their dirty work for them. Third, that a civil servant should apparently have accepted that instruction. Fourth, that there didn't appear to be a system whereby any concerns could be escalated up through the civil service hierarchy, or if there were, then they obviously didn't work. And fifth, that when David Cameron rightly sacked that special advisor, Theresa May subsequently re-employed them as one of her chiefs of staff at 10 Downing Street. Now, what message do you think that sends about acceptable standards of behaviour throughout the Whitehall system? And you can have all the high-flown principles of public life you like, and today there are more codes of behaviour than you can shake a stick at. But for there to be trust in the system, people have to see that there are direct personal consequences of failure or of bad behaviour. But if you play the parlour game of asking who was the last cabinet minister who took responsibility for the failure of the system over which he presided, I think the answer to that question is Peter Carrington in 1982. So what again does it tell us? That the last principled resignation in politics was nearly 40 years ago. Now, the second big Blairite change was the approach to media and message control brought in by Alistair Campbell. And after the mess of the mid-90s, as the Conservative Party struggled with Maastricht and sex scandals and BSE, a period during which your Chancellor served with such distinction, though not in the sex scandals, obviously, I can understand why an incoming government would draw the conclusion that they had to get a bit more of a grip. But the fixation with message discipline and the bullying which accompanied it, the obsession with the communications grid and with feeding and controlling the media have had a lasting and pernicious effect on our public life. Unfortunately, it became the new normal for all administrations that have come since, along with the trend of backroom boys becoming front-page stories, as the Chancellor has already mentioned. By the time I found myself back in Downing Street in 2013, it had become a pretty unassailable view that you had to take a position rapidly because of the requirements of the lobby briefing and the dictates of the news cycle. Indeed, when, as a cabinet minister, I suggested once that it might be a good idea to slow down a bit, say nothing, have a think, I was told by a sharp-elbowed young man that I simply didn't understand how modern communications worked. Actually, it was perfectly clear how modern communications were working. A downward spiral of hysterical coverage driven by noise and the short term, a media hammered by a dramatic loss in readership, competing desperately for market share, and politicians who didn't want or couldn't work out how to stop throwing buns out of the sledge to keep on feeding them. And that is a downward spiral which has unfortunately reached its apotheosis in the dismal so-called debate that we've been having about Brexit. Now, if you want to understand the nature of the change I'm attempting to describe, just watch two television series. Yes, Minister from the 1980s and The Thick of It from the early 2000s. And both are brilliant portrayals of the Whitehall of their time. In Yes, Minister, the heart of the action is the power struggle between the Minister and the Prime Minister and his permanent secretary, cabinet secretary. In some episodes, there's a small cameo appearance by a political advisor, but it's Humphrey Appleby and Jim Hacker around whom the plot revolves. By the time of The Thick of It, it was the bullying, foul-mouthed press secretary, not the minister, not the permanent secretary, who'd become the central character. Special advisors feature prominently. It's the civil servants who have just a walk-on part. And I think the numbers also tell a story. Back in the 80s, each cabinet minister was allowed to have one special advisor, although after a bit, the Treasury, because it paid for everything, was allowed to have two. So I think in 86, I was one of about 18 special advisors. I just checked before coming here tonight. By the end of December 2018, there are 100 working across government today, so a 5-fold increase. Has there, I wonder, been a 5-fold increase in the number of senior officials doing serious long-term thinking about the strategic policy choices facing the UK in, say, defence or foreign policy or technology? And if we just think about the period of 2010 to 2015, David Cameron, Special Advisor; George Osborne, Special Advisor; Ed Miliband, Special Advisor; Nick Clegg, Special Advisor, the European equivalent, and at a more modest level, me. And so this is not a point about their intelligence, any of those four, or their ability, but it is a point about the shift in the power of the post and the message that that sends through the system. In each of the first two departments I worked in, there were 3 government information officers whose job it was to give journalists factual information about the department's policies. What the numbers are today, I don't know, but I promise you it won't be 3. When I went to the DFE as a minister in 2010, we discovered that the previous administration had been spending something like £40 million a year on marketing its policies. Expenditure that we stopped with absolutely zero discernible effect, apart from on the numerous advertising and PR consultancies that had battened on the public purse. So I think another big post-97 change which has had an effect on the quality of thinking, or certainly the quality of administration, was the introduction of freedom of information legislation. Now, the intention of that was obviously good, but it has unfortunately had the effect of reducing the safe space for officials and ministers to have an open discussion, and for that to be recorded in an orderly way in writing. And there is, I think, a direct line from freedom of information to the spread of so-called sofa government. There is nothing wrong with informality, and politicians need to be able to kick their shoes off and shoot the breeze. But it inevitably leads to less structured discussions. It involves fewer ministers, including those who might be responsible for the matters under discussion or know something about it. The fact that all emails, notes on submissions, even post-it stickers became disclosable then led to more communication for a while being carried out by text, because that was non-disclosable at the time. So again, if you think about it, a small screen on your mobile, read while you're walking down the street or in the middle of doing something else, is not an ideal medium for considered decision-making. Now, there's one other way of doing politics which was brought in by Tony Blair in '97, which I believe has affected the way that government's been carried out ever since, the pursuit of what commentators called triangulation. And in essence, it's not new, but it was an approach whereby, using a lot of opinion poll research, you self-consciously define yourself in a space somewhere between your political opponents, in Mr. Blair's case, somewhere between the hard left and the Conservatives. And politically, in the short term, there's obviously something to be said for that. Mr. Blair won 3 elections, after all. But I think over time, it has led to a more managerialist approach and to policy positions which, because they're defined by others and driven by public opinion, may not have very much internal coherence. Mr. Cameron, Mr. Osborne were actually great admirers of Mr. Blair, and broadly speaking, they adopted his style of running Number 10 and of doing politics. Mrs. May continued the tradition by simply triangulating herself off George Osborne, whom she disliked far more than any Labour politicians. And the result is that it's been a long time since any political leader has tried to make a coherent intellectual argument and then persuade voters of that point of view. So I'm just going to turn now to some of the broader trends that have shaped our politics in recent years. It seems to me completely obvious that the development of social media has had a seriously negative effect on the system's ability to think and cope with the complexity of government. Not only has it played its part in speeding everything up and building more pressure for instant responses, it's fueled the natural desire that many politicians have for profile and publicity. It's much easier to win followers by tweeting a nice picture of a puppy or jumping on some passing bandwagon that will get you lots of likes than it is to work out a coherent political philosophy. And I thought that the stampede by MPs to be photographed with Greta Thunberg on her recent visit to Parliament, when they literally sat at her feet, looking up at her like the Magi visiting the crib, I thought that was a depressingly good example of this phenomenon of the infantilization of our political classes. And the spread of social media has also had a polarizing effect on the nature and tone of our political debate. And while it isn't as completely novel as some people claim, after all, those of us who still take the same newspaper every day, and we don't tend to do that in order to challenge our prejudices, but the use of algorithms to direct readers to stories that entrench and further radicalize their views is clearly having an effect. And the big difference from newspapers is anonymity, so that people feel able to say deeply unpleasant stuff that they would never say to your face. The standing of Parliament has also changed over those last 30 years. Back in the 80s, the idea was still firmly embedded that Parliament should always hear first. And when I worked for Ken Clarke at the Department for Health, he was introducing the most far-reaching reforms of the NHS for 40 years. But not one word of that announcement was briefed to the press before he stood up in the Commons. That could be frustrating for people like me. As part of our communication of the reforms to key staff in the NHS, we'd organised one of the first ever nationwide video conference link-ups made by the government. But because Ken's statement in the Commons kept slipping later and later because of the pressure of parliamentary business, the timing of our link-up with the staff kept slipping later and later. We missed all the evening news deadlines, but the convention that Parliament must be told first trumped all those other considerations. And of course, the world didn't fall in because the media didn't hear about it till after Parliament. On the contrary, the public seemed perfectly happy hearing about the news after it had happened, rather than the phony news we have today, where the line between briefing, leaks, and actual announcements is constantly blurred. So is it a surprise that people are so cynical about professional politicians and the bubble, when it does indeed appear to have all the characteristics of a game? The life and work of an MP has changed out of all recognition too. In Ken Clarke's autobiography, he describes how when he first became an MP in 1970, some of the old school Tory MPs only went to their constituencies once a year, where they'd be met off the train by the station master wearing a top hat. Now, since then, of course, the life of an MP has become unrecognisable. They are bombarded with emails demanding an instant response. They're stalked and insulted anonymously on social media. They suffer from this same time pressure and instant political culture which has blighted government. So it's perhaps not surprising that some of the newer MPs seem to see their role much more as though they are delegates of their constituents, and that their role is simply to reflect the views of the public rather than to develop positions of their own. And nor is it surprising that quite a lot of them have concluded that the pressures of being an MP today have become insupportable. So taken together, all these developments have helped make politics and government far more frenetic than I remember it being in the 80s and 90s. And I'm afraid that the determination of governments to try to control the news cycle has led to the almost conscious designing out of time to think about things. David Cameron, for example, was someone who was extremely good at making decisions. He enjoyed making decisions. He was equipped intellectually and as a personality type to do so. And it's true that the ability to make a decision can often be more important than the decision you take. But I still would contend that the most crucial requirement, if you're running a government department, a business, or a university, is to give yourselves time to think, to try to differentiate between tactics and strategy. And that differentiation, I think, is what government has been losing. Now, if I pull all these strands together, what picture do we have? I think we have a system which is now highly centralised, with much more power concentrated in the hands of Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, both of which are considerably larger than my time in the early 90s. One where more energy, wealth, and talent has been sucked from our regions, towns, and cities into London, where the speed of political decision-making has been accelerated and the amount of short-term political noise has been enormously amplified, where the day-to-day pressures on MPs have been increased, and where proper perspective on political developments has been greatly reduced, where people spend much more time thinking about the short term than they do about the long term, and where on Brexit, politicians on both sides of the argument have been fundamentally disingenuous, is the polite word, about the choices facing the country, and they've treated the public like children rather than levelling with them. So what could we do to try and make things better? I'd start by trying to reverse the centralisation that has been such a feature of recent decades, centralisation within government and centralisation in London. It seems to me that a healthy political system, a healthy society, is one where people take responsibility for their own actions. So maybe we should start by moving from an approach that has been top-down to one that is bottom-up. Too much government squeezes out the space for people to take control of their own lives, streets, towns, and cities. So my first step would be to inject a huge dose of localism. In Whitehall, we need to stop the micromanagement from Number 10 and the Cabinet Office and give ministers much more responsibility. But with that responsibility needs to come greater accountability. I think that most British people are prepared to give politicians power or accept businesses are paid huge sums of money if we can see that with these great rewards, they also have great risks. But watching ministers or MPs or business leaders or sometimes university vice-chancellors desperately trying to hold on to their jobs or their money or their pensions after they have failed is hugely corrosive of trust. And for our model to work, there have to be consequences of failure. I think that if we want to then encourage responsibility more widely, we must look at how we give people a greater sense of involvement. At the macro level, that probably means looking at the constitutional settlement between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and also at how regions, cities and towns can take back more control of their own destiny. And if you're serious about that, we're going to have to look at questions of tax and budgets and planning and recognise that localism means accepting the possibility of failure as well as of success. In terms of how government works, my top tip to the next Prime Minister would be to jump off the media merry-go-round. Ministers don't have to comment on everything or announce endless initiatives. Slow things down. Give yourself more time to think. Do fewer things better. I'd go back to the old convention of telling Parliament first, make it the place where all important announcements are made, stop the endless pre-briefings. It isn't just that Parliament has been undermined. As a tactic, it doesn't work because the public has long since realised what's going on and everyone has just tuned out from the mindless parroting of lines to take. I'd build cabinet ministers back into important figures in their own right. Give them more responsibility and freedom of manoeuvre, be tough on failure. Shrink the cabinet back to its proper size. About 1 in 3 government ministers are now able to toddle along to cabinet, which is Westminster's own version of grade inflation. For good measure, I'd get rid of the position of the Chief of Staff at Downing Street, cut back the Cabinet Office, work to raise the prestige and intellectual calibre of the civil service, and I would reduce the numbers of special advisors. Now, those are all things which I believe would make our system healthier and where you could start to change things quite quickly. Common to all of them is the concept of treating people like adults and trusting them more. And this links to my final point, which I think actually is the most important issue of all. How do we equip tomorrow's politicians with the intellectual scaffolding that they will need to make difficult decisions and trade-offs that being a leader requires? Sometimes in my gloomier moments, I find it difficult not to conclude that we seem to be moving from an age of reason back to an age of sentiment, where how people feel about an issue is held to be more important than what they might actually know about it. A new age of intolerance, where prevailing ideologies are enforced with all the zeal of pre-Enlightenment religious orthodoxy. Isn't today's online trial by social media seeking to stamp out heresy and shut down debate just a digital version of an auto da fe? Now, to someone who went to university at a time when you assumed you would be challenged on what you thought, when you'd have to justify your point of view with argument and facts, when you expected to be exposed to a wide range of views and made to think again, when you might be ridiculed for saying something stupid or unsubstantiated, I find the accounts of safe spaces, of no platforming, and of university authorities capitulating to the latest student campaign deeply depressing. Generally speaking, I'm sure that today's students work much harder and are more serious and thoughtful than my generation certainly was when we were at university. But to keep our political system healthy, we must expose them to a range of different viewpoints and equip them to argue and debate. They need the intellectual framework to work things out for themselves and to challenge conventional thinking, whether of the left or the right, and say that the emperor has no clothes. How will we encourage a society where people listen to other points of view and are prepared to compromise if the stock response to dissent or to some uncomfortable truth is to try to shut the debate down? So we need our politicians and officials equipped to say, no, you're wrong for the following X reasons, rather than saying, you must be a very bad person because you don't agree with the orthodoxy. So well done to the University of Hertfordshire for being one of only 6 universities out of 115 in the UK who were judged to be wholehearted defenders of freedom of speech in a recent review. We talk a lot about diversity in all our institutions, in business and politics, but we talk rather less about genuine diversity of thought. One of the phrases that I hear older people use quite a lot is, oh, I don't think we're supposed to say that anymore. Now, some of that, I think, is to do with the speed with which the approved vocabulary is pinging around at the moment. And people are afraid of using a phrase that might inadvertently mark them out as a bad person. But some of it also suggests to me that people are being stripped of the language in which they can express doubts about the latest fashionable theory to emerge. I think that strong societies need a balance between those who push for change and those who are more cautious. Why should we expect that the values of the metropolitan elites will automatically be shared by people living far from London? And more fundamentally, why should we think it is a good thing if they are? Let me end on a positive note, linked oddly enough to Brexit. Brexit, in my view, is a second-order issue that has been turned into a first-order issue by a failure of leadership and a lack of honesty about the choices that face our country. The difficulties of the last 3 years have certainly highlighted some of the weaknesses of our system: an overly concentrated centre, control freakery from a Prime Minister who was not up to the job, secretaries of state who tolerated being kept in the dark, and officials who I fear went along with some of the obfuscation. But these last years have also started a debate about our place in the world, which is long overdue, about the state of our union, about how we're governed, about how Parliament works, about the shape of our economy, and how we trade with the rest of the world. Brexit means we are going to have to try to answer those questions, to grow up, and to be serious about our options as a country. Now, in the same way as Brexit has forced businesses to question some of the assumptions under which they've operated for the last 40 years, so we must use Brexit as the trigger to look under the bonnet of our political system, as an electric shock to jolt us into asking more fundamental questions about where, together, we go from here. If we do that, then however we voted in the referendum, we might, just might, be able to agree that something good can come from it. And if we can rebuild trust in our political system, then I hope that one day some of the students here this evening will feel that you will want to play your part by standing for election and becoming an MP. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. I'd never heard anything that was less of a rant. I knew that was going to be the case. Would you be prepared to answer questions?
Of course.
Could I ask for questions rather than lengthy commentary? so that we can get as many people in as possible in a limited period. And perhaps you'd very kindly say who you are. I will try and cover as much of the hall as I can. You, sir, with your hand up halfway back. There are microphones which are on their way to you.
Hi, my name's Sami Desai. My question I was going to ask you about tribalisation in politics. Do you think a solution we could have is a more proportional voting system, like in the Netherlands or Germany, where we have a diversity of thought?
So, as someone from one of the two main parties, I'm obviously wedded to the current first-past-the-post system, which is obviously different from what we have throughout most of Europe, where the traditional trade-off has been between, if you like, stability and clarity against fairness. And what it's meant is that elsewhere in Europe, coalitions are formed between parties because they have to in order to form a government. And in Britain, we form our coalitions within our parties, and as you can see over the last 3 years, the two main parties are having problems in holding their coalition together. I think the thing to look for is what happens in the election. That if one party is able to form a majority, then I think how Westminster operates will revert quite quickly to what feels like normal, because one of the reasons we've had this difficulty is just simply because of the arithmetic. If there's another hung parliament, which is clearly a pretty possible outcome from this, where no one's got a majority, then I think some of these questions, firstly about the future of the two main parties, will we see a more profound breakdown of tribalisation and some reshaping? And if you do get that, and you are moving more into kind of coalition-style politics, then some of these questions about whether we change our electoral system, I think will come very quickly to the fore, in the same way that I think we're going to get more questions about having a written constitution. We've all happily survived without one, but because of what's been happening in the last few months, that whole question now, I think, is up for grabs. So I think in the next few months, we might finally be having that discussion about PR in Britain, but not if one party wins the next election.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You, sir, third row back on the left. And then the Vice-Chancellor.
Brian Tipping, investigative journalist. You disparage modern MPs as considering themselves delegates of their constituents. Many people would consider this a very democratic approach, and if more of the older MPs had done this, they would have enacted the majority decision of the referendum.
Yeah, so this question about representative democracy or delegated democracy is obviously, goes to the heart of what is the nature of the job of the MP. I think that the point I was trying to make was that if you take the view that your job is solely to follow what you're picking up every day from different pressure groups on the ground in your constituency, you may find that you end up with a rather incoherent set of political views, because it is how this tends to work is actually that MPs are being besieged not necessarily by their constituents but by a series of very well organised lobby groups. And I don't think it's terribly healthy if what an MP does is just run around after a lobby group. On your question about should MPs respect the result of the referendum, which I think you're asking, My answer is extremely straightforward and simple on that, which is yes, absolutely 100% they should. It was very clear that what the political system said to the people of Britain was, we're giving you a choice, whatever you decide we're going to do, and I think if you are not seen to honour that, the danger that does to our democratic system and trust in politics is massive. Sorry? So I do. I mean, it was actually one of the reasons, as your Chancellor said, I resigned straight after the referendum from Brussels, my job in Brussels. It wasn't because I didn't accept the result, it was the opposite. It was because I accepted the result, and I thought in my funny way, my going was a way of demonstrating that something had to change, and it was my attempt at taking responsibility or accountability for that moment. So I do think you have that big issue, you must accept it. What I don't think is it's very healthy if MPs are basically just mouthpieces for a series of pressure groups in their constituency.
Right. Yes, sir. Gentleman, just in the middle row, to make it most awkward for the microphone. Yes, if you would.
Jack Nelson, very unimportant person. Great lecture. And you have enlightened me about these advisors and everything else. Now, my question is this. The UK has been one of the oldest democracies in the planet. Then why do we have unelected bureaucrats in Brussels telling us what we can and cannot do? I've never, ever...
I think he's talking about you. I think he's talking about you, Jonathan.
Excuse me, my lordship. Excusing present company. Okay?
No. Well, so, I mean, I won't get a long answer on that because we've, in my view, we've answered that question. I mean, we answered that question in the referendum. As I said to the previous gentleman, I think we have to accept that result, and the sooner we get on with accepting it, the better that is. I spend my life these days talking to lots of businesses, overseas businesses that typically invest in the UK, and they're not doing it because of the uncertainty that we've got in the country. And in my view, until we stop that uncertainty, we're not going to get that investment. So I am strongly of the view, have been, as Robert knows, I thought we would have dealt with this after a year. And the fact we're still talking about it after nearly 4 years is a complete failure, and it is damaging our economy.
Right. Yes, sir. Back, almost at the back on this row here. Shall we make it 3 more questions, if we can get them in quick?
I'll try and be quicker in my answers,
next,
Robert.
yes, after you.
I'm a couple of years off of 90, and I only tell you that because I've seen the politics go down. I joined the Tory party in 1968, and I've watched it go down. We get professional politicians, which I find disgusting. You know, they do it for a living. We get people like Keith Vaz, who allegedly paid rent boys to get him drugs, and he's still in Parliament. The thing I agree with you is this centralisation. When I was adopted as candidate, it was local people who knew the area. I knew the area. I was local. It was what was right. Now we only have who central office decide they're going to drop in. So I think you're... Incidentally, I came here to demolish you, but I agree with everything you say. So don't you think we should really now step back 20 years and have the right to deselect MPs? Not only that, we must go local. And, you know, it's what local people want who know the area. And, you know, I'm just so terrified for my grandchildren at the moment that what's happening to this country, the quality of MPs. I listen to them on TV. Yeah, what, right, yeah. And that's the people representing us. So I'd like your view on that, please.
Yeah, so I do think going local is the answer. I think what tends to happen with centralisation is people try it, surprise, surprise, it doesn't work, And then, because it's not working, they then try more centralisation to try and make it work better. And that is the history of centralisation. And I think now is the chance we've got, because we are having to think as a country about ourselves again, which we haven't really had to reflect on, that you do have to go back much more local. When I was a schools minister, that was exactly what we were doing, trying to get local charities and teachers and parents to set up schools in areas that they knew to help children that they wanted to help, not the state. And I think that is a good model. I agree with you 100% that there has got to be much more shaming of people who behave badly in politics. They should be chucked out. I agree with what you said about Mr. Voss. I find it astonishing that that's not been dealt with. The one thing, in a way, that I'm probably most proud of that I did at the House of Lords, yes, Robert, I know I'm going to hurry up, was I introduced for the first time a power to throw out members of the House of Lords who behaved badly and brought the House into disrepute. Before that, it didn't exist. And they had codes of conduct to try and make them behave better, but the bad apples just carried on. Now we've got a power to throw them out, and that reflects the way I think about how we should handle these issues.
Thank you. Vice-Chancellor, you've been very patient.
Thank you. Quintin McKellar. Firstly, can I say that I think a recording of your lecture should be compulsory listening for whoever ends up running the country. We can, of course, redact a little bit about vice-chancellors. But we have a duty now as a university to encourage our students to vote. And we have attempted to do that. And on the basis of the numbers that we see of the 24,000 students who we've encouraged to register to vote, 70 chose to do so.
70?
No, 70. So you'll not be surprised that we have increased our campaign to try and encourage young people to vote. But is this not suggesting that our young people just now have lost trust in politics? And how, I mean, you've partly explained it, but how do you think we might engender that trust that they will be encouraged to vote in the future? Because it does seem a tragedy, the numbers that we're seeing.
Yeah, I don't. So I think, obviously, what's happened is that the nature of politics, which used to be conducted through the main parties, and people like the gentleman earlier would join a party when they were younger, and you kind of accepted a whole range of views that came with that. That's broken down, and I think young people are far more likely to be interested in individual issues about which they will feel quite strongly. I think the question, and that's why I was tiptoeing into the area about freedom of speech and challenge and engagement and so on, is whether they feel deeply enough about those subjects to forward a tweet and some Facebook thing, or whether they feel sufficiently motivated about it to find out about it and go and become involved in politics and try and change it. And I don't know. I mean, I feel that the more general infantilization of society, which I do think is going on, one has to try and encourage people to take this stuff more seriously, and that doesn't just mean virtue signaling, it means really grappling with this stuff. You know, politics is dreary and hard work. So I don't have an answer. I think these things go through cycles. I think I'm interested in your statistic about how many of your students have signed up, because what we hear quite a lot of is young people feel so strongly about Europe and the referendum, and therefore we just give them the vote and then you can change the result. Well, they didn't feel that strongly last time as actually to bother to turn out and vote. And if they don't turn out this time, I think that tells us quite a lot. But I congratulate you as a university on at least trying to get them to take part in our democratic process.
Are you game for two more questions,
I am,
Jonathan? So
I don't want to...
lady at the back now.
A student at the university. Just to cover your point, although this wasn't my question about 70 students, I'm a mature student who's always been on the electoral roll since I was 18. So no, I wouldn't have my name down on that figure. And I think a lot of the students here would be in my position whereby, yes, we vote, but we wouldn't be signing up because we have been registered for some time.
Right.
My question to you, though, is that, as you say, inevitably the future MPs will be coming from students. But how can we expect these students to act in a mature way when they get into Parliament, when they're repeatedly witnessing immature behaviour and inappropriate actions, and not just what the gentleman over here said about the words that are being said in Parliament, but also things like the Grenfell Tower report being leaked early? That was a disgrace. And as far as I've heard, there have been no repercussions to that, which I just find, well, as I said, a disgrace.
Yeah. So I broadly agree with you. I mean, one of, I suppose the central point I was trying to make, looking back over 35 years, is that I think a lot of the approaches and systems around how we handle these things have deteriorated. And I'm very struck when I was at university, I wrote history, and I spend most of my time now reading about history, not about politics, that because there is no sense of history, the characters who are now doing the jobs that I used to do in a different way, they think ancient history is 2010, and prehistoric history is 1997. So their points of reference don't encompass an appreciation which would lead them to conclude, hang on, this is getting worse, not better. So they're like little hamsters in a wheel. And so I think the only answer, I mean, I agree with your analysis, I share it entirely, is that if you can fix some of these problems that I've been talking about, which I think are fixable, how you handle announcements to Parliament, stop the briefing, stop the culture of swagger and braggadocio, I think you can make a change. I don't know if you've been following what the new Speaker, the one that's just been elected, Lindsay Hoyle, has been saying, where he's basically sending a very strong signal, I'm going to be like an old-fashioned Speaker. I'm afraid the last Speaker was part of the problem you describe. It was all about him. It was not about the institution. The new one actually has said, when I become Speaker, I am not going to keep ripping up parliamentary convention, which is what the last one did in a very profound way. He's going to go back to more traditional ways of behaviour in the House. So I think those things are fixable. I'm quite, as I tried to argue right at the very beginning, I'm not completely depressed and suicidal about this. I think our system, us, the people, are surprisingly resilient. I don't think we've changed. I think some of the things I'm describing are at the top of the political system that have gone wrong. And I think behaviour and culture is incredibly important. The lead comes from the top. So I think you could fix that. Then it operates in a way then that more of your friends look at it and think, okay, this is something I would be prepared to be part of.
Thank you, Jonathan. One final question, if I may. Yes, lady at the back there. On that, yes. I think you were waving, well, it was you, sir, was it, waving your hand? Yes.
Hello. Maxwell Smallman, St Albans resident and businessman. You said about that ministers should try and get off the media sort of bandwagon. But how do you feel about restrictions being put on MPs to actually drive that bandwagon? For example, MPs or elected representatives should not have their own radio shows. They should not have a regular column in a newspaper. Of course, they can be interviewed and they give occasional pieces, but not in the systematic way that allows them to put pressure on the if you're going to restrict ministers, to also restrict other people, to put pressure on the ministers by driving the media in that way.
Yeah, so as it happens, I'm in favour of MPs having outside interests. I mean, I think one of the things, and it was a point made by one of the earlier questioners about the professionalisation of politics. So more people who've come in and they've been professionally in politics all their life and not doing things before. So I think having people who are involved in other things, see other aspects of life, is rather good. So I'm not in favour of banning people's outside interests, even if that includes journalism. I think people can form their own view about that person's judgments. My point about ministers and for MPs, what's happened is that there is a culture which is that you've got to comment on everything. I don't think you need to introduce rules, you just need to behave differently. And what it leads to is initiativitis. So going into a government department is like going on an archaeological dig. You can see, if you're interested in history, the history of all these random announcements that some minister has made in order to get some little story and some headline, and then some officials are set up to run a policy around it. Right. 10 years later, they're all still there and everyone's forgotten what it was for in the first place. So I think it's more that stuff that stop having endless announcements just for the sake of showing that you're doing something. Stop feeding the media the whole time with immediate responses, and then I think largely it'll start to sort itself out, because peer pressure, all of us, we're affected by the behaviour of people around us. So if all your peers in government are rushing around talking too much, and then you see that the ones being promoted are the ones who talk the most, well, what conclusion do you think you draw? And so I would argue, if you send another message through government, you will change the behaviour of all your ministers, and then of your MPs who want to become ministers.
Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. I hope you realise that you've had probably one of the most attentive audiences, even during the history of my time as inviting chancellors, lecturers into this hall. I think everybody, I think I speak for everybody, we've hugely enjoyed what you've had to say. It's difficult, isn't it? There's almost as though there's a paradox. You have a technological revolution which changes society. I don't know what the effect, for instance, of quantum computers is going to be over the next 50 years, but it's going to obviously provide us with another enormous leap, even beyond what we've experienced over the last 20 or 30 years. These technological changes lead to vast social change, and they undermine the standing of government institutions and the people who run them. It happened, you're a student of history, as we all know, for instance, at the beginning of the 16th century, or the end of the 15th, with the introduction of printing into Western Europe. But at the same time, you have this curious paradox, which is that if you're going to be able to cope with this new world, as you yourself said, you need to take the time to think about how you deal with this new technology, what it brings in its wake, and how you can make it your servant in society rather than your master. If you fail to do that, you probably, if I can pursue the 16th century analogy or comparison, you get somewhere near what happened to the Spanish Empire rather than eventually the success we made of it for a moment in this country. It does seem to me that the paradox is this is happening at enormous speed, but at the same time you need to slow it down, which is a point that you have made with enormous skill, if I may say so. Because as my own special advisor said to me when he first came to work for me, as a former clerk in the House of Lords who knew about legislation, he said, what you must remember is that all we have in the end is process. And the process has broken down. Let me give you, if I may be indiscreet, one little anecdote, if you'll forgive me descending into my anecdotage. Those who with very long memories for very minor developments in British politics may remember that I got into trouble for making a deal over reform of the House of Lords with Tony Blair. And when I secretly went to see him in the flat above number 11 where he lived, he approved the deal that I'd come to with the then Lord Chancellor, Derry Irvine. And then he said, well, I think that's fine, but I'll get back to you tomorrow after I've made sure that Alistair has approved it. I think, Jonathan, that would be a fair illustration of what you've been talking about and how the process has broken down. And I think we owe you an enormous debt of gratitude for the clear analysis you've given of this, because quite apart from anything else, the consequences are with us every day. Inevitably, legislation which has to be well considered and thought about, and which should not be entered, like marriage, should not be entered into lightly, has become too often a form of political advertising, and we suffer as a result because it's legislation which is governing us. So I think you and I talk often enough, Jonathan, for you to know that I profoundly agree with the analysis you've given us this evening.
Why do you think I gave it?
See, he always has the last word, you know. I have no answer to that. But I do profoundly agree with it. We know that change is coming, but change for the better is not inevitable. It's in our hands. And I think if I take one message away from what you've told us this evening, it is a very important message that in our traditions of politics, it is in our hands, us the electorate, to make a success or a failure of our system so that it's our servant rather than our rather obscure master. So, Jonathan, thank you a million times for coming, for taking the trouble, for speaking so brilliantly, and for holding the audience in the palm of your hand, if I can put it like that. Now, we have a tradition also of offering you a memento of your visit, which I hope will remind you of the welcome you've had here this evening. It's a piece of glass which was designed by a graduate of this university, and it gives me the great pleasure to thank you for it.